All right, so let's get started. Welcome everybody to the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network's monthly webinar for the month of November 2025. Um, Today is all about embedding culturally safe practices in shelters. So I want to start by providing a land acknowledgement, and normally I'm joining you from London, Ontario, but today, oh, I see we have a raised hand. Um, Sorry, one moment. Madison, if you have your raised hand, you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box, and I'll be able to answer it. Uh, but so normally I'm joining you from London, Ontario. However, today I'm doing a bit of traveling, so I'm currently in Grand Prairie, which I'm working from Treaty 8 territory within Turtle Island. And I acknowledge the Beaver, Cree, Dene, and Métis people as the original caretakers of these lands and surrounding areas. And I just honor and respect the history, languages, and culture of the diverse people who call this territory home. And I'm very, very grateful to kind of do this work. But I also want to acknowledge that CSTN is part of a national network. So from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. I subscribe to land acknowledgements by personally stating what I can do as a treaty person, and I encourage others to seek learning and discourse about Indigenous communities. And those that learn, please share, and please ensure we're sharing truth. So, with that, then, I want to move over to some housekeeping items. One is that on your end as an attendee, just to keep the background noise down a bit, because we are such a large audience, your computers are muted. There is the opportunity for attendees to ask questions. However, I would encourage you to not put your questions in the chat just because it is more difficult to monitor that because there tends to be a lot more activity in the chat, especially with people introducing themselves. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure that there's time at the end of the presentation, today's session, to answer those questions. Content from today's session is being recorded. So the recording and some of the content from today's session will be circulated following the webinar. I typically get it out about a week or so after the webinar takes place. And our time together is approximately 90 minutes. I really don't want to go over that time. I want to respect your time to get back to other work items in your schedule. So we aim to wrap up in 90 minutes. So for those of you who may be newer to CSTN, we are a growing network of shelter leaders and organizations across the country who share a mission that is simple yet very powerful. Um, we want to connect and support shelters that are committed to becoming housing focused and to being engines to ending homelessness in their communities. So we're really trying to build a national movement that helps shelters do this work more intentionally through learning, through peer connection and shared advocacy. One way that we do that learning is through these monthly webinars. And at its heart, really, CSTN is about equipping shelters to help people move forward faster with dignity and housing at the center of everything that we do. So here's a few different ways that we can really support shelters with this transformation. One is through events like today with our monthly webinar series that are only possible thanks to really brilliant people within the sector across the country sharing their knowledge and inspiring us to kind of do some really great work. There is on our website a self-assessment tool that can really help shelters with identifying the progress that they're making towards becoming a housing-focused shelter. So what work that they may have already done that's already in alignment with that approach and what work is still to be completed for greater alignment. You'll also see on the website that there's lots of tools and resources that we share from various providers across the country. so that you don't have to feel like you create everything from scratch. You can learn and borrow from folks that have developed some really great stuff. You'll also see on the screen here is a QR code. Please feel free to pull out your phones, use your cameras to follow that QR code if you're interested in registering as a member. Membership is free and you get to choose your adventure when it comes to membership. So you can um, be very active and choose to participate in things like leading webinar sessions or other advocacy pieces, or you could take on a more passive role where you're more interested in just attending some webinars. Um, Whatever you decide is up to you. Um, and really, as a member, all it means is that you will receive the occasional announcement or information coming from the network about events or current things that we're working on. If you want to learn more about us, find access to the resources, or find the archive of all of our webinars that we've done in previous months that you may not have been able to attend live, you can find them at transformshelter.ca. And just a reminder that today's session is part two of a two-part webinar series titled Manaaji'idiwin, Pathways to Culturally Safe Shelter Practices. And Manaaji'idiwin is Ojibwe, meaning life in the fullest sense. It's about well-being, harmony, and balance. So again, let's welcome back. Joining us this month to lead the session is Cassandra Harris and Bradley Stone from Giwatashkad program at Atlosa Family Healing Services. And so specifically in today's session titled Manaaji'idiwin, meaning respect, honor, compassion, we will build off of the learnings from the first session that took place in October and learn practical ways to integrate culturally safe, respectful, and effective supports for Indigenous shelter guests. And so you as attendees will hopefully gain tools for embedding Indigenous cultural practices, building strong community partnerships, and aligning shelter operations with reconciliation frameworks. So this is a bit of our agenda for the day. And so then, before I pass it over and do introductions to Cassandra and Bradley, I really wanted to pose this really critical question that some of you may be wondering is to say, why is the integration of culturally safe practices um, the work of all shelters, not just Indigenous-led ones? And so there's a few reasons we can think about when it comes to that. One is I think we are aware that Indigenous people are dramatically overrepresented in homelessness statistics in every major city. And that isn't random. It's the result of colonial policies, loss of land, and systemic inequities that still shape our housing systems today. And it means that any shelter, regardless of mandate, already serves Indigenous guests daily. And so, despite the scale of Indigenous homelessness, Indigenous-run shelters remain few and unevenly distributed. So many communities have no Indigenous-led option. That means the majority of Indigenous guests stay in non-Indigenous-run shelters. And this gap really kind of underscores the urgent need for culturally safe practices in non-Indigenous shelters. Since most Indigenous people are being served in these mainstream shelter systems, those systems must be equipped to serve them with respect, dignity, and cultural safety. It also highlights a policy and funding blind spot. So more investment is likely needed in Indigenous-led shelter capacity, and better data collection is needed to track exactly how many Indigenous-specific beds exist versus what's needed. It's also important to consider that some Indigenous guests may choose not to access Indigenous-led shelters because people they know, like things like people like family, community members, or former friends, work there. For those seeking privacy, distance from community dynamics, or space from strained relationships, this can feel unsafe or uncomfortable for some. There's also the legacy of colonialism and Christian missionary influence. which disrupted kind of that cultural continuity for generations. And so as a result, some Indigenous people have complicated and painful relationships with culture. So a culturally grounded shelter may feel unfamiliar for some Indigenous folks and perhaps intimidating or simply not aligned with where they're at in their own personal journey. So reconnecting can take time, and for some, it may not feel right at that time. These realities really reinforce that cultural safety is about choice, it's about dignity and respect, and not necessarily assumptions. So our role is to create environments where Indigenous guests are welcomed into cultural practices if and when they choose, rather than being expected to participate. And so the last thing that I'll just hit on before doing an introduction to Brad and Cassandra is that cultural safety shouldn't be viewed ever as an add-on, right? It's a core practice for equity and effective service delivery as shelter operators. So when Indigenous guests feel respected and connected to culture, they're more likely to engage in things like case planning and potentially things that will help them move towards housing outcomes. So we need to integrate these practices really as an act of reconciliation, making sure that our shelters are safe, inclusive, and accountable for the Indigenous guests that we serve. And so with that, I will introduce and welcome back today's speakers. They're going to walk us through some practical, concrete actions that shelters can take to become culturally safer spaces for Indigenous guests. They'll also share approaches that any shelter, regardless of size, location, or mandate, can begin embedding to ensure Indigenous community members feel truly welcomed and adequately supported. So let's welcome back Cassandra Harris. Cassandra is a settler of predominantly Irish heritage with some French, German, and English ancestry also sprinkled in. She has spent over 10 years building relationships and working for various Indigenous-led First Nations organizations in southwestern Ontario. Cass grew up in the city of Sarnia, close to the waters of Lake Huron and the St. Clair River, and moved to London in 2005 to attend university. She started at LOSA in 2021 as a community care worker at Wigwamanon Shelter and moved into a cultural safety training role in 2022. Today, she is the Knowledge Exchange Coordinator at Giwitabiwag, which is a training program at Adlosa's Giwatashkat Indigenous Homelessness Team. Everything Cassandra shares in her work is what she has learned through building relationships and spending time with Indigenous folks, and she walks through the world with a ton of privilege, deep gratitude, and a big mushy heart, praying and finding ways to put them to good use. So welcome, Cassandra. And then also joining us is Bradley Stone. Bradley is of Dakota and Plains Cree ancestry from Whitecap Dakota First Nation and Mosquito Grizzly Bear's Head Lean Man First Nation in Saskatchewan. He is a proud father of two daughters who help him understand the beautiful gift that being a father is. Basketball is a strong passion of his, as is 90s hip hop, which you may or may not hear him quoting from time to time. Reconnecting to Indigenous culture and spirituality has helped Bradley in his identity, healing journey, and recovery. He has worked in various capacities as a helper, from housing, outreach, case management, cultural coordinator, youth engagement, to recreation coordinator. Combined with his recent education endeavors, obtaining a social service worker diploma and mental health and addictions diploma from First Nations Technical Institute, this has provided Bradley with a wide array of skills, understandings, and life experiences to continue this work as a helper in a good way. In his journey, he remains thankful and has learned to practice four things for balance and self-care: to pray, to laugh, to cry, and to share. And so with that, welcome Cassandra and Bradley. Welcome back, and I'll pass it over to you, and I'll stop sharing my screen. So welcome.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Grant. I'm just going to pull up our screen presentation. Hi, everybody. It's me, Cassandra, again. I'm happy to be here. Can everybody see, or maybe Grant, you can give me a thumbs up. Can you see the presentation? All right, cool. I'm going to pass it over to Brad to get us started then.
Thanks, Grant. Thanks, Cass. Hamatakiapi, Wambadihi, Hadeska, Amakiapido, Wapahaska, Hechuate, Mosquito Ochinia, Wapita Wakantanka, Ampeti. So what I said in the Dakota language is my spirit name is Brown Spot Eagle. I come from Whitecap Dakota First Nation and Mosquito Grizzly Bears Head Lean Man First Nation. And I also said, thank you very much, Creator, and it's a good day. I've seen some check-ins from Saskatoon. I actually grew up in Saskatoon. My reserve is just southwest of Saskatoon, Whitecap. So some of you are probably familiar with that reserve. But born and raised out in Saskatoon, and I moved to Toronto and then moved back home and then moved to Sarnia recently. So I work here as the community capacity builder, and Cassandra and I are the Giwatabawag team. And so this is the things that we do. We do Module 1, Module 2, and community fires. Some of the things that we do in our roles. And I'm very happy to be here, very thankful to be here. And it's an honor. It's an honor to come and present in this way and share this information, share this knowledge, share this wisdom, and share in this way, this virtual delivery with all of you on the webinar today. So at LOSA Family Healing Services is a charitable Indigenous nonprofit organization situated in southwestern Ontario, dedicated to strengthening the Indigenous community through Indigenous-led programs and services that offer holistic healing and wellness. We understand the social inequities Indigenous peoples face are the direct result of settler colonization. Therefore, all of our services work to reconnect people to a sense of culture and positive Indigenous identity, using cultural interventions as a basis for healing and wellness. Our vision is a community where all people have access to the support they need to live a good life, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. We have our head office in downtown London, where we have our outreach team, our housing support worker, our Oka Danage anti-human trafficking program, our cultural justice team, our admin staff, our land-based healing lodge team, who, by the way, are usually out doing their land-based healing workshops and delivery. And of course, Cass and I, like I mentioned, the Giwitabawag team. Giwitabawag is an Anishinaabe-Moan word, meaning returning to sit in a circle. And usually we deliver these trainings in person, and we all sit in a circle. We all start with a smudge as well. So we had a little smudge, I had a medicine going as well as we started here. And just in your heart, just visualize that we're all sitting in a circle today as well. We also have our Wigwamanon location, which is our shelter site that has 28 beds and the staff, including community care workers, our cultural support team. And it's where our housing support workers also operate out of. There's a sweat lodge on site where we host regular community sweat lodge events, as well as other cultural community events. And we have our Yakia Tekenhas Women's Supportive Housing and Jawanong Women's Shelter, which are also located near downtown London area.
Great. So we're going to go through a brief recap of our last session, just a few slides here so we can continue to build off of that foundation today. If you weren't able to join us for the last session, you can access the recording on the CSTN website, because I think they really go together. In our previous session, we learned that Indigenous homelessness is the direct result of generations of systemic displacement and discriminatory government policies through the structure of settler colonization. So we shared these three pillars or power dynamics of settler colonialism from Arthur Manuel, which are dispossession, dependency, and oppression. We looked at the ways that historical and current colonial governments have enacted and continue to enact violence in the form of legislation. So the legislation that dispossesses Indigenous nations of their homelands, creates a dependency on the colonial state for survival, and continue the ongoing oppression of Indigenous individuals, families, and communities. Settler colonialism is active in Canada every single day. And if we want to create safe shelter spaces, it is essential to understand these power dynamics and the ways that settler colonialism continues to harm Indigenous peoples. In part one, we saw that Indigenous homelessness began right at contact when nations began to be displaced from their homelands through settlement, warfare, and land surrender treaties with the British Crown. And we went through a high level of some of these Indian Act policies that are on the screen and legislation that were created with the purpose of erasing Indigenous peoples from existence, or what the government kind of euphemized as assimilation. That's really genocide. Controlling the movement of Indigenous peoples through the creation of reserves in the pass system, criminalizing being Indigenous by outlawing ceremonies and cultural practices, destroying family and community relationships by targeting children and forcing them into residential schools and Indian day schools where they experienced horrific abuse, and further displacing Indigenous children through the child welfare system and 60s scoop. Indigenous peoples face many challenging outcomes resulting from these genocidal policies, including complex intergenerational trauma that ripples out from individuals to families to communities and nations. Settler colonization has severed Indigenous relationships to land, identity, culture, family, and more.
Yeah, so like Cass mentioned, our brief history lesson last time really showed that Indigenous homelessness is the direct result of settler colonization and the policies aimed at the erasure of Indigenous peoples. What we have here on the slide now is the definition of Indigenous homelessness that comes from Jesse Thistle's research and the stories of hundreds of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Indigenous homelessness is defined by isolation from being in a relationship or from a connection to the Indigenous understanding of all our relations. This includes displacement and disconnection from culture, language, identity, and a sense of belonging. In the Truth webinar, we shared the 12 dimensions of Indigenous homelessness, which you can see on the screen here. These come from Indigenous peoples across Canada and were gathered through Jesse Thistle's research as the 12 most common types or manifestations of Indigenous homelessness. They can be layered or overlapping, meaning they may be happening simultaneously, or they can apply at different points in someone's life based on changing circumstances. These dimensions are meant to be a map or a description of someone's complex experiences, not clear-cut black and white categories. Last webinar, we looked at residential schools and how arguably all of the dimensions can apply to residential schools. And we also shared and explored how these can be applied as a case management tool to hear and understand someone's complex experiences of colonization, to make better referrals, to increase empathy, and to connect to cultural resources and ceremonies. In about 2017, the City of London approached that LOSA noting a high rate of Indigenous homelessness and that they weren't successfully engaging. They partnered to conduct Indigenous-led research, and in 2017 and 2018, spoke with over 100 Indigenous folks with lived and living experience. In 2021, further research was conducted as part of developing Giwitawag training for service providers. If you'd like to learn more about the Giwitashkad plan or its evaluation, you can check our at LOSA website as well. What we want to share here are the top findings from our Indigenous community engagement. The research shows clearly that cultural connection is extremely important for Indigenous peoples, and that there is a high rate of institutional avoidance due to racism, mistrust, and a lack of cultural safety within non-Indigenous services. Essentially, this research confirms an urgent need for culturally grounded, Indigenous-led housing services and supports, as well as an urgent need to increase Indigenous cultural safety across all services in London. Thus, Giwitawag was developed to increase the capacity of service providers to provide more culturally safe and effective care to Indigenous peoples. And this is the work that Cass and I do, and we focus on as a part of our larger Giwitashkad team.
All right, so through the research in 2021, we found some common reasons for institutional avoidance of homelessness services, including shelters. We learned that Indigenous folks are avoiding services because those services do not account for their unique experiences of settler colonialism, or that services don't address a set of barriers that they face due to being Indigenous. The interviews we did revealed a stark contrast between the way individuals saw themselves and their cultures and communities and the way that they were perceived and treated by the non-Indigenous community. Without any specific prompting, over half of respondents reported experiences of racism when accessing housing and social services. These experiences ranged from being picked on because of their skin color, to being stereotyped, subjected to racial slurs, being overlooked for jobs and dwellings, to being totally dismissed as without value due to being Indigenous. A very common way in which folks reported experiencing racism in services was that their relationships to culture are often dismissed, so leading to mistrust in accessing services. This is a big one to pay attention to. Being non-Indigenous myself and working at an Indigenous shelter, I can relate to some of the feelings or considerations that may or may not come up with regard to this. Non-Indigenous workers might naturally feel a discomfort with things that are unfamiliar or things that can feel awkward asking about, like asking people about their cultural preferences, for example. So a dismissal of someone's culture might look like neglecting to ask about cultural reconnection at all, not seeing it as a priority, and not assisting them to find what they need, or it can look like actively creating barriers such as not allowing smudging or other cultural practices in your facilities. We also found that folks were avoiding services they perceive as re-traumatizing, places where the direct environment exposed them to substance use or violence, maybe too many locking doors, or not having any privacy, for example. It's important to keep in mind that Indigenous peoples are at higher risk for re-traumatization based on institutional abuse. So, in other words, we can consider how they might feel walking into institutions that could trigger memories or feelings associated with residential schools, Indian day schools, Indian hospitals, or prisons. We also spoke to a few people who preferred to live from the land because it was healthier for them or gave them a sense of pride. So again, as a result of all this, we see a really high rate of institutional avoidance, many Indigenous peoples choosing not to access services out of fear and mistrust. And to add to that, many Indigenous folks who do access services will often not identify themselves as Indigenous for many of the same reasons. So overall, the consensus from our lived experience engagement is that services at non-Indigenous agencies do not recognize the effects of historic and ongoing colonization. Agencies aren't equipped to understand Indigenous participants' unique experiences of racism and adapt their services accordingly. So in other words, to understand colonial trauma and adjust their services to avoid re-traumatizing Indigenous peoples. So that's what we're going to get into today. This is the definition of cultural safety that we use up here on the slide. Cultural safety is an approach to service delivery that involves ongoing self-reflection, forgot to bold that, and organizational growth to address cultural, historical, structural differences and the power dynamics within the care that is provided to Indigenous peoples. So I'd probably bold power dynamics as well. Culturally safe care is colonial trauma informed, and like it says, acknowledges and addresses the power dynamics of settler colonization at all levels, individually, relationally, organizationally, and at the systems level to provide effective, equitable care. Like we mentioned in part one of this series, there is an important distinction to make between cultural awareness and cultural safety. Though there is a common tendency among service providers to believe that learning Indigenous culture is the answer to providing culturally safe care, this viewpoint can actually be harmful. Cultural awareness, or the knowledge of specific Indigenous practices, foods, languages, etc., is different than cultural safety. So cultural safety may include learning about culture, but it must include moving beyond this to addressing the actual barriers, harms, and power dynamics within organizational relationships, policies, and practices. This is done through ongoing critical self-reflection and examination by looking at the ways in which organizational or program policies, procedures, and practices can create barriers or replicate colonial power dynamics like dispossession, dependency, and/or oppression. It's also important to note that the only one in the position to determine if care is culturally safe or not is the Indigenous person receiving care. So, I know probably there's lots of talk about cultural safety. We have a few questions throughout the presentation today. It's my first time using Mentimeter, so please bear with me. It's kind of an experiment that you guys are helping us out with. But if you want to scan this QR code, and I'll kind of go back and forth. The first question is whether or not your organization's workers have taken any cultural safety training before. I think Grant can also put a link in the chat. And then we can see each other's answers. Can you see the second screen, the Mentimeter screen? Yeah, okay. Well, good to see that so far the majority of You guys have started to take cultural safety training, and I really like that Grant said at the beginning it's a really core component, not an add-on, and it should be done continuously, and integrated fully. All right. Well, thanks for doing that. There's a few more questions that'll come up. I'll move to those ones as we go along, but it's more just to get a sense of where everybody's at for some of these things. So again, it's essential to understand how settler colonialism operates so that we can start to see how colonial power dynamics are replicated in our services. What this might look like for folks. These power dynamics could be things like tone policing, dispossessing someone of their emotions, like I'll help you out, but only if you calm down first, or only if you change your tone when you're speaking to me. These are power dynamics at play. It could also look like a dismissal of culture or someone's indigeneity, like we mentioned previously. For example, not allowing smudging in your facilities. It could also be a deprivation or dispossession of someone's coping mechanisms or social supports. So if we think about things like substance use policies, guest management policies, pet policies, what are we dispossessing people of through these kinds of policies? In the work we do, there is also an inherent dependency on colonial systems and institutions and an inherent power imbalance between workers and participants. If you work in a system that relies on coordinated access, for example, like we do, it is not a choice-based system, right? You get what you get. Dependency is also exacerbated through things like needing to have ID, needing to have money, needing to have a status card to access some services for Indigenous folks. And then oppression is exacerbated through a lack of empathy, understanding and awareness, and cultural competency amongst workers who may not have the proper training or experience, or who may not be well enough themselves to be supporting others. I also tend to think of the requirement for like deficits-based assessments tools here, like the SPDAT, VI SPDAT, that tell us more about someone's trauma than their housing needs. Other examples, case notes that center the worker's perspective over the participants, or that use judgmental, subjective, or deficits-based language also reinforce these power dynamics. The notes in HIFIS, for example, can follow folks around, and workers can easily adopt biases based on what they read from another worker or organization. The word someone uses to describe a participant can be a really good indicator of how safe of a person they are. And of course, as you can see here, the big example that our team came up with is lengthy service bans or restrictions, which you may call a loss of service or a service limitation, etc. Obviously, this is an active dispossession as the participant is left with no place to go or the things they need to sustain themselves. This is a reenactment of colonial land dispossession that left Indigenous peoples with nowhere to go and little means to take care of their basic needs. Service restrictions can also be re-traumatizing and likely prevent that person from seeking support again due to feeling unwanted, unloved, or bringing up past experiences of trauma. Service restrictions can also be viewed as an act of oppression. This can get controversial. The practice of applying the same exact rules to everyone does not consider that Indigenous peoples face settler colonialism each day. They're starting at a different place than others, and so they may need different services. So as an Indigenous-led program, we develop our guidelines based on the common average that we see, and this meets the safety needs of most of the folks that we support. Beyond this, though, we work to meet each participant where they are based on their needs. From time to time, this means making an exception of a guideline for a participant who will be negatively impacted otherwise. When we do this, we do it consciously and with discussion amongst our team. Overall, our policy is that breaks are better than bans, far more better. We usually will start with like a 5-minute break or a step away, some people call it, and go from there, not just strictly sticking to a service restriction. That's like our little graph down here. I didn't make it, but all the general guidelines that work for everybody. And then every so often we really have to flex those and make an exception for someone that can be life-saving. In the previous session, we shared a story about a participant for whom our team made an exception. There were staff who thought that we weren't able to support him because of some frequent disruptive emotional outbursts that he were having, and they were having trouble engaging with him. Other staff who had more experience, and unfortunately, they've witnessed a direct connection between loss of service and loss of life, knew that it was essential that our team found a way to support him. They spoke with him about what his needs were, and he expressed he just needed a place to yell, to let it out. He had a lot to release. They put up a little teepee outside the shelter and rolled in a cot there for him. They found out while he was in there, he has type 2 diabetes, and his blood sugars were really contributing to his moods. So they were able to start treating him for that. Eventually, working with him, checking on him, they were able to bring him back inside. And he was actually willing to access psychiatric supports for the first time in our service relationship with him. And he is now housed. I think what made the biggest difference in this case is that this person saw what lengths the team was willing to go to for him. So that trust was established, and he was able to start accepting some of the supports that he wasn't willing to in the past. All right, so essentially, we encourage organizations to reflect and to find out where you can work in the gray. Where can you be flexible? Like, what are your hard and fast rules and why? Why are they so? Sometimes workers can slip into a settler colonial mindset of having to have all the answers, for example, need to know all the answers, having to be in control, having to have power over. We can forget, right, in a busy, stressful environment, we can forget that we're not here to police people, we're here to support them. So to make services culturally safe, we need to get away from arbitrary black and white rules. Weguamanon is a relatively small shelter. So when I worked there, we had 36 beds. Currently, there are 28, and staff are able to work closely with the folks that are there for a longer stay, working towards their housing. Staff are able to explain the rules, and they're able to be flexible to meet people's needs. So it'll be up to you how to take these ideas and apply them to your circumstances. So here are some guiding questions that may be useful. Like, who does this policy or practice benefit? How does this benefit them, and at whose expense? Again, is this policy or practice dispossessing someone of something that they rely on? Does it promote dependence on our organization? What is the potential for abuse of power? And then some of these are more around service restrictions or for workers in the moment, things to consider. This one's really big. Am I uncomfortable or am I unsafe? What does safety look like for this person that you're trying to support? What harm could happen to them if they are restricted from service? What other options do I have to still address the challenging behavior? So we're not saying just to let everything fly, right? There's other ways that we can work with people, like taking a short break, finding a creative solution, even maybe setting up a meeting with that person more formally to see, okay, something's going on here. What do you need? What's the need behind the behavior?
So now we get this incredibly awesome opportunity to flip these power dynamics right on their heads. This is at LOSA's culturally safe care model, and this was developed as part of the Giwatashka strategic plan, which was designed specifically for the homelessness sector. As you can see, this model promotes the opposite of the colonial power dynamics by prioritizing relationships over dispossession, empowerment over dependency, and safety over oppression. Culturally safe services prioritize the working relationship between a worker and participant as a therapeutic intervention in their healing and housing journey. This means seeing each participant as a relative and as a very important individual. We're taking the time, care, and attention to develop the relationship in the same way we would with a coworker. Building an effective relationship with Indigenous participants also requires self-reflection and self-awareness of power, biases, and stereotypes we may be carrying. How do we come across to an Indigenous participant that has experienced colonial trauma and racism? Culturally safe services work to empower folks to be the leading force in their care. This means assisting participants to care for themselves as often as we can, taking their lead and listening to what they want for their care, and respecting their free will, whatever their choices may be. From a culturally safe perspective, we recognize we do not know best what the individual needs, but rather our job is to ask them what they need and be a support person to present their options and help them navigate the journey there. The message of colonizers was that the colonizers knew better than Indigenous peoples. Empowerment means we're helpers and they are in the driver's seat. I came across a quote one time that helped me understand the power of empowerment. And it was that I don't want you to save me. I want you to stand by me while I save myself. That's kind of our role as helpers. We're helping these people to understand how they can save themselves. We can be that middle person to help them get to the services that can help them get there as well. Advocacy is a big part in that as well. Culturally safe services work to ensure that all participants feel safe and are safe. This means providing judgment-free support, getting to know participants, and providing what it is that each person needs to feel and be safe. Safety also requires that as workers, we are role models to model effective emotional regulation and boundaries. These are key features of a safe environment that many Indigenous participants may not have had modeled in their lives. Safety requires that we are aware of power dynamics and that we work to counter these. It's also important that we are mindful of the words we use when we talk about participants, whether it's in our logbooks, our case notes, or amongst and between fellow staff members. And so, from an Indigenous perspective, relationships are absolutely central to the quality of care that is provided. It can be useful to think about relationship building and maintenance as an actual intervention that you will employ, similar to how you may pursue referrals. Positive relationships also help to build resiliency. We want people to feel safe when they walk through our doors, interact with us, or in simply hearing our name. We can create this sense of kinship and mutual respect by how we engage with our clients and participants each and every time we see them, whether we are their direct care provider or not. If they feel that warmth and kindness each time they see us, they will come to understand that we truly are a place of healing and caring. Being colonial trauma informed helps us in being able to approach our work in this sincere and respectful way. The 12 dimensions of Indigenous homelessness help to guide us in our approaches to this relational work that we do. If we are mindful that someone coming to us for support is experiencing any of these dimensions, then we can come from a place of respect, kindness, empathy, love, and patience, as these are deeply rooted issues within and have likely plagued them the majority of their lives. Kindness goes a long way in our interactions. We're helping someone feel a sense of belonging they may have never felt. Together, we're helping to create the supportive environment to nurture their spirit. Due to the chronic and ongoing colonial harm they have experienced, Indigenous peoples may be incredibly distrustful of you or your organization. This has nothing to do with you as an individual. They may be wondering, due to past experiences of abuse, neglect, and harm, if you are a safe person or if they can trust your expertise or suggestions, especially if you are in a position of authority or are non-Indigenous. So we say, introduce yourself. We recommend starting by introducing yourself by your name, your role, your family, where you grew up, etc. Focus on finding commonalities by asking them questions about themselves and just be genuinely curious. It's also good to share what kind of things you do in your role or how you may potentially help them. It's also good to be mindful that sometimes these kinds of experiences, such as intakes, assessments, applications, rules, curfews, etc., can be triggering or re-traumatizing, and we have the opportunity to be a supportive environment with a heartfelt sense of engagement. As helpers in the helping field, we can share things we may have in common, as this is often appropriate self-disclosure, and we can help to create a feeling of connection. For example, you could share if you had some similar lived experiences, or if they like pizza, hey, you like pizza too. Or if they have a pet, you also have a pet too. There are hundreds of distinct First Nation, Inuit, Métis nations across what is now Canada. So we recommend you research your participants' Indigenous nation through Googling or reaching out to an Indigenous support worker you know. While it is acceptable to ask the participant about their cultural practices and preferences, and they may know these things, it is not their responsibility to educate you, and doing so takes away time from their care. As you get to know them, take note of their likes, dislikes, and preferences. In our team, we have gone so far as to create participant profiles with notes on what they like and even what they tend to need for de-escalation. We share this information across our team to ensure that the care they receive is the same from each staff. For example, a participant who really likes to listen to a certain genre of music for de-escalation will play that. Also, physical environment is important. The hospitality in terms of providing water or granola bar goes a very long way, as this is a key cultural difference. This also includes whether you meet outside, inside, how the space looks and feels in terms of safety. Pay attention to small things like letting the participant choose where to sit before you do. For us, having the teepee and sacred fire as a space to sit in and around while we engage with our participants can be really helpful in being in a safe and respectful space. We recommend warm transfers as often as possible when referring. This means physically accompanying participants to a new service or attending appointments with them out in the community. Being there with them can show that you truly do care and respect the journey they are on. You will also benefit from collaborative care by working in conjunction with other organizations that they need, specifically Indigenous organizations like us. Some workers go so far as to give small gifts to participants to build the relationship and show their care. For example, a non-Indigenous social worker gave an Indigenous youth a small stone that was part of her collection at work when the youth asked. Another worker we know learned about the participants' clan and gave them a small notebook with their clan colors. Gift giving is an essential cultural difference. Trust. Most of all, to build trust, you need to be transparent and consistent with the participant. This will help to set their expectations for what they can hope for and accomplish. As workers, it's totally okay and encouraged to show vulnerability and humility. It humanizes us in our relationships with our participants. We don't need to feel like we always have to have all the answers. Our relationships with participants are evolving and developing as we continually get to know them. When we show care and respect in all aspects of their lives, we can aim to create a mutually respectful relationship where we can come to each other when times are good, when there is an issue to address, or even in the most mundane moments, which can help build trust. When we have the good rapport with someone, it makes it easier to address small things before they become bigger challenges. Over half the people we spoke to in preparing for this series told us about the need for workers to listen to them and empathize. They also cited a lack of listening as a reason to avoiding services. Many Indigenous cultures have oral traditions, meaning that listening is the largest part of communication. As you can see the quote there is always something to learn if you just listen. Active listening is the most effective form of listening that involves three things: validating feelings, paraphrasing or reflecting back, and asking open-ended questions to clarify information. The first step in active listening is to validate feelings. We can take the time and space to understand how someone else feels in order to help them feel seen and heard, to show them that they're important and that we care about them. A key step is to speak to their emotions and feelings by naming them and affirming them. You could say, "I'm sorry that you're feeling anxious. That sounds hard." Paraphrasing is another step in active listening. This means providing mirror statements or restating what you heard back to the person in a different way. If someone is telling you about how they are upset with their family because they want to talk to them, an example of a paraphrasing statement would be, "I hear you're frustrated at your family because they haven't called you back." With paraphrasing, you may worry you'll get it wrong, but it's okay if this happens. The person will correct you and tell you what is true for them. That's the point of paraphrasing. Asking open-ended questions as an effective way to actively listen. This means asking questions that cannot be answered with a yes or no. These are some examples on the screen, such as, do you use a lot of drugs per day? Or you could ask, how frequent is your drug use? There's the other one here. Do you want to be connected to cultural services? An open-ended way is, how do you feel about being connected to cultural services? This is very effective because it shows that you're listening and that you care, since you want to better understand. Rather than giving direct advice, which can sometimes be unwanted, you can ask questions to help the person reflect on their perspective or what they want to choose.
So here are some of the more common scenarios to be aware of too in supporting Indigenous participants: asking about Indigenous self-identification and having conversations about referrals to Indigenous cultural services. Asking about Indigenous identity is important, and we recommend that all organizations ask this as a mandatory part of intake to every single person. We can't tell who is Indigenous or not by looking at them because Indigenous folks come in all shades and hues. When you ask, we recommend keeping it straightforward. Do you identify as First Nations, Inuit, or Métis? So you can expect a range of responses to this question. Many people choose not to disclose because they may have experienced racism and discrimination, or because doing so may not directly benefit them. You could also get ambiguous responses like, I don't know, I think my dad was, but I don't know where he's from, or yeah, but I don't have a status card. These responses are the result of settler colonialism and the Indian Act, categorizing Indigenous peoples based on blood quantum and disconnecting Indigenous families through things like the 60s scoop. So, like I said, it's important to ask everyone. Organizations can update intake and referral forms, databases, and so on to reflect this information so that it is a mandatory question. It will also be important to be able to comfortably and confidently explain why you're asking. You might get that, like, why do you want to know response from people, and how sharing this information will benefit them. So you could affirm that this is an important part of their identity, that you want to provide them with the best care possible, and that you might be able to refer them to cultural supports if that's something they would like. We recommend educating yourself and other staff on the diversity of Indigenous peoples and ensuring that you have the basic knowledge of the nations and communities in your area before you broadly begin asking this question. This will make it easier to respond supportively to those ambiguous responses or to open up further conversation. So if they don't know, you can ask if they are interested in learning more about that part of their identity. Or if they respond yes, that they are Indigenous, you could ask them, hey, which community are you from? Both of these opportunities for relationship building. The second scenario we have here is around referring to Indigenous cultural supports. It's extremely important to ask Indigenous participants about the extent to which they would like cultural healing approaches to be part of their care plan. As we know from the definition of Indigenous homelessness, connecting to identity, culture, community, and family is what ultimately provides a sense of home, belonging, and wellness for Indigenous peoples. However, we also cannot assume that everybody wants this. Because of the nature of colonial trauma and assimilation, accessing culture can be re-traumatizing for Indigenous peoples. So it's really important to ask and to listen carefully using those skills from the previous slide to their response. Again, we recommend asking in a straightforward way. You could ask if they're connected with their culture and spirituality already, whether they have a preference about about culture being a part of their care plan with you, and be prepared for this to lead to other conversations. As with the first question on Indigenous ID, you can expect varied responses based on the impacts of colonization. Some people may have experienced colonial traumas that make it difficult to want to pursue culture. For example, they may have attended residential school or day school and been punished for doing so. Or they may have different spiritual or religious beliefs stemming from Christianization and colonial missions. You should also be prepared for answers regarding substance use and culture. Due to widespread addiction and mental health epidemics stemming from colonial trauma, some Indigenous peoples have coped by taking an abstinence-only approach while heavily relying on cultural ceremonies. So some people may have heard that they are not welcome at ceremonies or cultural events, or that they can't access cultural supports if they're still using substances. So while this approach works for some, it can cause harm for others. And at Atlosa, we use an Indigenous harm reduction approach. We allow and welcome people into cultural healing, whether they are still using substances or not. So again, with this one, it's important to explain why you're asking, that you want to make sure you know what their preferences are so you can support them the best way possible, and that you could help connect them to cultural resources if that's part of what they would like for their care. Always take a non-judgmental approach guided by empowerment and respecting their free will. If they don't want to be connected to cultural supports, that's perfectly fine, and you can check back in with them as their care progresses. If they're interested in being referred, it will be important to provide a warm transfer, calling up an Indigenous worker or agency and physically accompanying the participant to make that connection. It might also be useful to address confidentiality concerns. If they're worried about being referred because they know a lot of other Indigenous people in the community, you can reassure them that their information is kept private and that they have options to protect their information. Again, you can speak about Indigenous harm reduction and support them to connect with an agency like Atalosa if you're close to us, or an elder that you know that is open to supporting people who use substances. All right, so cultural communication differences vary across First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, but these are some of the more general, like larger communication gaps. For many First Nations around this part of Turtle Island, storytelling is customary. You may be operating from a Western European cultural communication template. You may ask a direct question and expect a direct and clear answer. However, when you're speaking to an Indigenous person, what you might get is a story. For example, when we were interviewing Indigenous participants for this training series that we do, we used some general guiding questions and on a few occasions noticed that they would choose to answer a question with a story. So it's our job as workers and helpers to ask ourselves during these interactions, like, how does this story relate to my question? Or why is it important for this person to share this story in relation to my question? Often when we do this, we find deeper insight and then we can ask questions to learn more. So in traditional Indigenous cultures, silences are acceptable anywhere. We don't have to fill that uncomfortable silence like we're kind of conditioned to in the dominant settler culture. Nodding signifies understanding. It doesn't mean that they agree with you. It just means that they hear the words you're saying, and that they're listening to you. Gifts are regarded as social glue. Kind of touched on that about the importance of that in building relationships. Knowledge is oral and experiential versus this tradition of printing and literacy in the dominant settler culture, right? Get everything in writing. Like the written word is just as canon. It's all got to be written down. We have mountains of paperwork. While for Indigenous people, somebody's word, like your word, or just the experience that you have of something is just as, if not more valid of information. Giving unsolicited advice is rude. So this has happened to me a couple of times as well. In the helping field, especially, we want all of our conversations to be people are coming to us for help after all, right? Like we want conversations to be solution focused, but sometimes it's just that somebody wants you to listen to them. So I've gotten that look before when I've given advice without their consent, and they're like, "I didn't really ask you. Why are you telling me this?" So we just recommend getting someone's consent, checking in. Hey, do you want me just to listen, or would you like to hear some additional thoughts about this? Family is extended family, right? Cousins called brothers and sisters, really large family relationships versus the nuclear family. That's something that I think really affects like guest management policies, for example, to look at things more broadly like that. And then, of course, like we kind of touched on already, reasoning for rules is offered and available versus the authority is to be respected view, right? Many of us probably had parents that when you asked that question as a child, why? They said, because I said so. I know I did. And that doesn't really fly at the Indigenous shelter or with a lot of people, right? It's important that we're able to get away from arbitrary rules just because it's written in your policy. It's everything should have meaning. Stories are told about absolutely everything in creation in many Indigenous cultures. Like, why does the chipmunk have stripes? I always use that as an example, but everything has meaning. So it doesn't make sense just to be authoritative about it.
Yep, family is definitely extended family. I got a lot of cousins back home and a lot of cousins that still owe me frickin' $20. So here we have cultural items. Indigenous peoples may have cultural items that they care for. In Indigenous worldviews, everything is seen as alive. Everything is seen as having spirit. Cultural items are extremely sacred, most often handmade and gifted to the person through prayer and ceremony. They often contain stories and original teachings, and that person is actually said to be the caretaker of that item. Cultural items can be found on a person, such as tobacco ties, beadwork, medicine pouch, or in a person's belongings, like a drum, pipe, animal pelt, ribbon shirt, ribbon skirt. And on the screen here, you can see a ribbon shirt here. You can see a medicine pouch, and you can see a Pelagan, they call it around here. Back home, I remember calling chanupa, the pipe there. They were to be handled with care. Only touch them if absolutely necessary. Always ask before touching. Listen to what the person is saying. And don't throw these out. Return them to Atlosa if you're here in the London area, to an Indigenous person who will know how to properly take care of them and pass them on to the next caretaker. If there isn't anyone around you can give them to, please research your area for an Indigenous organization you can contact and speak to them about these sacred items and learn if they can help. And if there's any policies in place, or look at your policies and see what is your policy around these kind of items. We had a shelter worker who attended a module training that we do in person here in the London area, and they weren't aware of this, and they mentioned that previously, because when somebody doesn't come back to their bed or whatever, then their items are left there, and if they're left there for an extended period of time, then there's a bag and tag policy with some places, and they just bag them, and if they don't come, they throw them out. And so she said going forward that they're going to ensure that their policies are looked at and their staff are going to all be aware of these kind of things, so that if they come across these in people's belongings, they're not going to throw them out. So just help me understand the value of this approaching, sharing this kind of information in this educational way, and why it was a part of a strategic plan to address Indigenous homelessness, and understand, because this could mean home to somebody as well. This could be their connection to home within themselves as well. So we have Indigenous harm reduction here. Here at LOSA, the way we operate and deliver the majority of our programs is Indigenous harm reduction in practice. Culture, traditional medicine, spirituality, and ceremonies are offered throughout our interactions, and we collaborate internally and externally to help ensure access to culture is possible. Whether it's the case planning, group approach, open community event, or ceremony, we aim to be inclusive and supportive in others being able to access this in their life. In doing this, we're looking to reduce the harms of colonialism. Our outreach teams, they have harm reduction gear, the clean gear and stuff like that, and all the things that people will need for harm reduction. And for Indigenous harm reduction, it could be as simple as having a smudge kit available. And so our outreach team always makes sure they have smudge kits as part of their harm reduction they can give to the participants and the clients they see and the people out in the streets experiencing homelessness. And I just want to share real quickly about how having this access to medicine is important and how it can help those that we're working with. I worked at a friendship center before, and I had somebody coming in to ask for sage. The first thing came was, "Can I have sage?" I was like, "Yeah, of course. I want to make sure we have access to traditional medicines." I didn't question it. I gave him a reusable cloth bag, drawstring bag. I filled it with sage. I gave it to him, and we have a Rise and Shine program that we had there. And the next week he comes again asking for sage, and he gave me the empty bag. I was like, "All right, cool." He's smudging, so I filled it up, gave it back to him. Again next week, same thing, empty. But his demeanor in the beginning was very serious. Didn't look at me, didn't want to engage with me. Just get the sage and leave. And as he was coming at each week, it's like his demeanor was changing. He was becoming more receptive to me and looking me in the eyes and talking to me. And the last one he came, I just asked him, I was like, "Hey, how's it going?" When I gave him a sage. And he's like, "Brad, I just got out of jail. And before I got out of jail, somebody came and shared with us that smudging can help us. And so I got out and I've been smudging every day. And it's been really helping me with my anger. I don't want to go back to jail. And smudging with sage has really helped me." Like, I didn't tell him nothing about smudging or anything. It was just him smudging on his own. And it, to me, reaffirmed that the power of our medicines and why they're important for us to have them in our lives. They really help with us cleansing and mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically. But I just want to share that. And also this quote at the bottom: home is reconnecting the culture. There's prophecies, there's sayings, there's teachings that we're on a generational shift, and people are coming back to their culture, our ceremonies, our songs, our dances, our ways, everything. And they're finding that sense of belonging and sense of home within themselves. And there's a quote I have here, and I shared it with Grant when we seen him the other day. It's like, when you take care of yourself, you help take care of the nation. So as we all take care of ourselves, we're looking to also take care of our people and our nation as well.
Yeah. So here, promoting and prioritizing safety begins with staff and the organizational culture at your agency. So working for an Indigenous-led organization has completely shifted the way that I view and do my work. And I honestly think I'd have a hard time like working with anybody else or for anybody else at this point. At Losan, we Wamanon prioritize a culture of balance and holistic wellness. Our larger Giwatoshka team meetings are done always like in a circle format. Everyone is on the same level, no one is above the other, and everybody participates. We start with a smudge and a round of check-ins and introductions so that we can relate to one another, get to know one another as human beings, and know how each other are doing. We close with a self-care round and share how we plan to take care of ourselves over the next 2 weeks until our next big meeting. And we share why that's really important, right? We're building that culture. When I worked at Wigwamanon, we checked in with one another during shift changes, so we could let our shift partners know, hey, I need to lean on you a little bit today. It's been a rough one. We also have invited participants to join in at Wigwamanon staff meetings when we have them out in the teepee. So it's pretty like open. It's just that culture of safety is being modeled and created. Our leadership has even given thought to decolonize like the job titles and the roles over there. So we have a full-time firekeeper at the shelter. Instead of a custodian, we have lodge caretakers. Instead of security, we have lodge protectors. We also hire folks with lived experience, and we always prioritize hiring Indigenous peoples. So, when we're taking care of ourselves as staff, when we're showing care and kindness towards ourselves to coworkers and participants, we're modeling that wellness for participants. Staff training and development and team building are just like so important, as many of you probably know. And we mean beyond your CPI, assist, first aid. These are all important, but even things like reflecting on our positionality, understanding our biases as workers. If you remember during our community engagement, the way some of the participants told their stories indicated that workers' biases and stereotypes were preventing them from finding out the awesome and good qualities of Indigenous peoples. People know when you're thinking these things or feeling these things or how you feel towards them, even unconsciously. People will pick up on that. So self-awareness is huge if you can find training around that, and cultural humility, being aware that I don't know what I don't know. So we have chores around Wigwamanon that you have to do if you're there for a longer stay. But sometimes workers who are newer, they may need reminders that the folks we're supporting may not have even learned certain life skills that they take for granted. One that came up with a participant or someone with lived experience in a training was like, I didn't even know how to ride the bus. I don't, I had to be shown how to ride the bus in my late 20s. How to make a phone call, making a bed, sweeping or mopping, things that many of us, due to our positionality, will take for granted. So slowing down is easier said than done, obviously, in this line of work, but taking time to pause once in a while and check in can go a long way. Yeah, just letting people be human. All right, we just have a couple slides and I totally failed on the Mentimeter thing. Sorry, guys. We tried to pack a lot in here together. But again, acknowledging that there are very different types and sizes of shelters. So a lot of what we have shared is not a one size fits all. We hope this information helps you do the best you can for whatever your situation is. What can you do within your circumstances using these ideas? It can be really about finding ways to be kinder and remembering that small things can have a big impact. So to summarize some of the top things today here, it's essential to understand colonial power dynamics to grow your awareness and prevent them from being replicated in your services. So you want to prioritize relationship, empowerment, and safety at all times. Use strengths-based, not deficits-based approaches wherever possible, legitimizing and affirming Indigenous cultural practices and making them available for people. Promoting Indigenous leadership. So these things, cultural practices, ceremony should always be Indigenous led, but we can support people to be able to access them. As non-Indigenous people, sorry, like speaking for myself, cultivate a culture of kindness, training for frontline, team building is essential. This should always be grounded in the holistic wellness of workers. Helping Indigenous peoples reconnect to their cultures and communities, like I said, is really important. And we didn't really get have the time to get to this one today, but building relationships locally, learning about the resources in your community is extremely, extremely important. So proactively building these relationships, learn about the importance of tobacco for some cultures, not every culture, and make sure they're a good fit for your organization if you want their support as well. For example, do they support people who are using substances, Indigenous harm reduction? We encourage everyone to consult with Indigenous-led consultants to review policies and conduct strategic planning within your organization. And as usual, pursuing further training on Indigenous cultural safety, because everybody, all of us can uncolonize and make our places safer across the board. Okay, I guess we only had that one slide left. Um, I don't even know what to do. What do you think, Grant? Should we do any more Mentimeter or just jump into some Q&A?
Um, you know what? I say like I like Mentimeter. Like I like seeing people's results roll in. So yeah, I think it should just take a few minutes. So why don't we take
You
a
want
few
to
minutes
try
to do
it?
that? Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I mean, you put the work into creating it. Let's use it, right?
Yeah, kind of. The next question. We just had some questions, but I knew it was going to be tight time here. So this one is an open question. Like, what is a policy or practice that replicates dispossession, dependency, or oppression? This can be at your organization, or another organization that you know. And it's just open to what you maybe learned today or some examples that you can think of that we didn't mention. Um, have at it. Yeah, involuntary discharges. Yeah, I'm glad people are picking up on service restrictions and bans. They're very harmful. We want to always make people feel like they are important and cared for and loved. Yes, rules that do not recognize nuance and cultural differences, not having privacy, the diet. Yeah, what's available for people? Are they dependent on what you're feeding them? I love that one. Over surveying clients with questionnaires. And if you're doing that, we always recommend compensating people for their time and their effort in any way possible, having incentives.
Yeah, but I also just as kind of these responses are rolling in, kind of add a little bit, Cassandra, too. It's like this piece
Yeah.
around access, and it can be like really small, simple things. Like when I've traveled to see shelters, it's like, do folks in your shelter have open access to like pour themselves a coffee when they want to, or do they have to go to a counter and
Hmm.
ask a staff person, "Can I have a coffee, please?" Right? And just that continuous permission seeking through a transactional relationship can really add to that piece around dispossession and dependency.
Yeah. Deficit-based paperwork. Yeah, so much of it. Locked doors always. Yeah. At Wee Woman, when I worked there, you needed to have staffs like swipe you out. It was a completely secure building. That posed a lot of challenges. It's different now, but hmm yeah, belongings. What an ongoing challenge for shelters, eh? Bans for disrespect when de-escalating tactics should be trained. Lack of communication about rules or expectations. Yeah, so I'm seeing a really awesome theme here. Looks like a lot of us are in agreement about these things. Can move on to the next question. Does your agency ask about Indigenous self-ID at intake as like a mandatory question? Nice. So majority, yes, are already doing this. Happy to see that. I know like we did the Giwatosh plan came out in 2020 and that we made sure that this was a mandatory question in our local HIFIS that is a self-ID question toggle. So good job, guys. If you're not doing it, that's something that you can look at to change on your forms and get staff comfortable asking that question. Do you or your organization have a relationship with an Indigenous organization, community, or worker? So just to see, or are you Indigenous, work for an Indigenous organization? Are you already working with somebody? Are you working on it, or do you have no idea where to start with this? Great. Yeah, so like I said, it's really important to reach out proactively, not just like when you need something, not just during June Solidarity Day or even worse, September, Truth and Reconciliation. We don't want to be putting that labor onto Indigenous peoples. So at any time, just, calling somebody up and starting that relationship by visiting and getting to know one another without anything attached to it. Okay, good. Yes, we work together often. Again, some really positive results. So I think that is all of the Mentimeter questions that we had today. Thank you for participating.
Thanks so much, Cass and Brad. Like,
Mhm.
I'm also just like so easily impressed. Like, I just get such a kick out of like Mentimeter and stuff, like just watching results roll in. I find it so
Yeah.
entertaining. That was amazing. So thank you for the time that you took to prepare that and to present that to us. Lots of positive feedback in the chat, and I think lots of stuff
Mhm.
grounded in like concrete things that people can think about integration into their organizations when they leave here. So very, very much appreciated. We do have about 13 minutes to look at some questions that maybe are already in the Q&A box. So folks, if you do have questions, now is the time to kind of add them in there. But I'll start maybe if you're okay, Cass and Brad, with the questions that are already in there. And this first
Sure.
one comes from someone who says, and I think you kind of already answered this, but if you want to revisit it or add to it a bit, is how does a worker identify which resident wants to participate in their cultural practices without asking too many questions?
Um, I think just checking in getting a really quick pulse check. Oh, are you like, hmm. It depends, right? Like, I would first of all see if they already are connected with that. Don't make assumptions that they are or aren't. And it could be something like an invitation, like, hey, I saw this. Are you interested in going together? Depends what it is. Or when you're just having that conversation with somebody, just being really straightforward about it. Would you like us to support you with culture as part of your care plan?
Mhm. Yeah. I think the slide that you had about like scenario, what to expect,
Yeah.
engagement tips were really great visual reference to help with that exact question.
Hmm.
Mhm. Okay, we also have another question here that says, what if the community resources for Indigenous folks in town are not accepting people who are not yet sober? How do we navigate these conversations? Specifically, if we are not Indigenous, how can we help support cultural support if we don't have access in our community? Are there online supports that might be available?
I'm going to share something real quick.
Sure.
Well, when I was looking at Indigenous harm reduction in different places that are doing that, one quote that really stuck out to me was the one person saying that there was somebody that was trying to go to culture or ceremonies, but they were denied because they're still in active addiction. And the person, their quote was that when you deny me access to the culture and ceremony, it's like you're taking away my identity. And what we're trying to do is help people understand and reconnect to who they are. And so, I mean, maybe it's a learning curve for some of these cultural practitioners or medicine people or knowledge keepers to understand that our people need healing. And I remember in downtown Toronto, there was a drop-in program, and I shared this with Cass before. Is the person that was there? They would have start with a smudge, and there was a lot of people that would go there. A lot of people experiencing homelessness. And I remember going there. I was like, "Man, it's packed here. Like, there's so many people here." And some of the people were still, you know, under the influence of something, but they would go around and offer to smudge them, and they would smudge, and they all enjoyed it, and they all felt a sense of identity and togetherness and belonging there. And I asked somebody asked her, is like, why do you smudge here if they're still like drunk or high? And she was very simple, and she just said, because they need it. They need this. They want this. And then there's other ceremonies where you have to be 4 days abstinent, and there was not as much people as over there, and it just kind of helped me understand that our approach and how we provide this access to culture and ceremonies and medicines and identity really can help the people that we're working with. And I think maybe it's just having a conversation with these community service providers in your area and saying, hey, we have these people who want this, but they can't because of they're still in active addiction. And how can we work together to ensure that they can get there, or they can access the medicines, the culture, the ceremonies, and all this stuff, and because they want it, and that's our sometimes our job is we're there to help them get to where they want to go. And then we might be the middle person, like as I mentioned earlier, and how do we have those discussions with people to be like, how can we collaborate to provide this? And maybe you might be that innovative person that's going to help spark that service being provided to people by having those maybe honest but maybe tough conversations sometimes, because at the end of the day, who's the one that is kind of suffering or not getting the support they need is the client that we serve. That's my little take on it. Cass, you want to add anything to that? Or
No, that's awesome because I'm like, I've been so fortunate that I haven't been in that position before, and it sounds like it would be really challenging. But maybe even just, if you have a relationship with somebody who does work in that way, obviously always being respectful and just saying, okay, like the folks we're supporting are using substances. Do you know anybody that might be open to supporting them with cultural access and checking in or checking in at that person's nation where they're a member and seeing if there are resources there. That's all I can really suggest, though.
That's great. And I think like the first time I met with a director at your organization, we were talking a little bit about Indigenous harm reduction and adopting that approach at Adlosa. They had mentioned that there was some consultation with elders from your community about this piece, about abstinence and requirement or not for participating in ceremony, and through that consultation with the elders saying like, yeah, these are our family members who need this medicine, these practices, and we don't turn away our family. And I think
Mhm.
that kind of guidance and consultation from the elders really kind of helped then, from what I heard from the directors, like take shape to go in that brave direction.
Mhm.
Okay. We also have another question here that says, starts with a statement. This was awesome. I agree. Beyond
Thanks.
OCAP principles, how can non-Indigenous shelter leaders work with Indigenous communities on data collection? Ooh, good. And program planning guided by culturally safe, non-extractive approaches. So what guidance exists for building a strong foundation for authentic co-development?
I'm always for Indigenous leadership and letting Indigenous people lead that research, conduct that research. And I guess it's not really beyond OCAP because that's what that is. But also being really clear on what a formal consultation looks like. We've had sometimes, situations where someone will have coffee with one of our directors or one of our staff members and consider that to be like I consulted with Indigenous people. So, um, yeah, and maybe asking them like, what does this mean to you? What do you want out of this? So we thought about including there's like the 4 R's. I think it's more of an academic based way of engaging, but it's like respect, relevancy, reciprocity, and responsibility. So those 4 R's, those principles when you are reaching out. Good question.
Mhm. Ooh, these are great questions. Do you know of alternative tools that are used for assessment rather than the SPDAT?
Well, I only know of the Path tool that is being piloted in a few communities, and we really wanted to pilot it here. It didn't come to fruition, but that seems like an amazing potential, like the Path tool, because it's grounded in relationship and it's focused on housing needs rather than like trauma. But the Path tool,
Mhm. And
and
that was developed by the
I
National
think
Indigenous Homeless Council.
yes, that's right,
Okay.
NIHC. Yeah.
Okay. Brad, anything to add to that? No?
No.
And I think we kind of touched on this in the last session, not assessment, but case planning is like using potentially like the 12 dimensions developed by Jesse Thistle as helping kind of framing your case planning with folks. Uh, okay. So another question here. My organization is involved in the RFP process to select shelter operators, so are not actually providing the services. Do you have any advice regarding criteria to evaluate housing providers that apply? Ooh, good question.
Do you want to take this one first, Brad?
You can cast.
Um, Something is like mandatory Indigenous cultural safety training, if that's is possible. Maybe I didn't hear the full question. So what are some criteria to include in the RFP,
How to
like
like
request?
evaluate housing providers if they apply, like how to evaluate the strength, I think, of their submission that integrates cultural safety practices.
Okay, yeah, like demonstrated relationships or partnerships with Indigenous communities or organizations. Um, hmm, I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm stumped. You guys stumped me on that. Um,
But I think that's a great one too, is even like do you have formal or informal existing relationships and not just like, ones that we kind of threw together at the last minute with the submission, right? Like demonstrated strong relationships.
yeah, demonstrated too, and to get like, I don't know, it's challenging when cultural safety training or when relationships become like a checkbox as well. So that's the other tricky thing around that too is like a meaningful relationship. So you almost have to have the Indigenous organization or community speaking on behalf of their relationship rather than someone gloating about their relationship, I guess.
Hmm. I'm wondering too, if I was evaluating the submission, if part of it would be valuable to see if their policies and procedures reflect kind of the cultural safety that they promote in their application, right?
Yeah. And having somebody on, like having Indigenous people, like more than one, ideally, on that,
Hmm.
what's that called? Assessment, reviewing those RFPs.
Right. So
Hmm.
that representation and leadership from the Indigenous community on the selection or review committee of the
Yes.
applications,
Yeah.
right? Hmm. Okay. 2 minutes left, so I'll move quickly here. So if a connection to cultural services is offered and the person declines, is it appropriate to ask why? Could I say something like, I noticed that you had declined a referral to cultural services. Can you tell me a little bit as to why? And then explore with them from there?
Brad, do you want to take that one at all?
Sure. Yeah.
All right.
So I think so. Historically, you're looking back at culture and colonization and residential schools, and so I've come across people on my path too that me, I'm so I love my culture. I love our ceremonies. I love our songs. I love being in that medicinal setting. And so sometimes I assume that my fellow Indigenous person also wants that. And so as I explore and meet with people and engage with people and chat with them and talk with them, and then sometimes I realize that the residential schools have now, how do I say this? They're Christian or they're about the Bible or they follow that, they're raised in that, and then they're not raised in a cultural way. And so there's two sides of that. One, they might just stay in the Christian path, I guess you can call it, with the Bible, and not go into culture. And there are some that maybe they don't fully feel they align with that, so they want to now reconnect to culture. Or there's some people that are totally against Christianity, the Bible, and stuff like that because of residential schools, and all they want to do is go through culture. And so it's a matter of being respectful and sincere and asking people, and if they do decline, respect that as well. And then it's okay to check in, I would say. You never know, like somebody could be what they don't know. And as you share with people, and sometimes maybe they weren't growing up with that, with culture, access to culture, or because of that, the guilt and the shame, they don't feel worthy of accessing culture, or feel comfortable in accessing culture, or their family wasn't raised in culture. And then you have some people who may have been part of the 60s group, and when they reconnect to culture, they go right in there, and the culture is guides everything that they do in their life. And as a worker, as part of your care plan, case management, case assessment, whatever it is that you do with person, even just randomly, informally checking in with people. But I feel like it's okay to ask somebody, and if they decline, but just see and constantly check in. And then this way they view you as somebody who is mindful of that culture is also something that they can access through you. And as it's trust as well. As you build trust and respect, that word. Where they,
Reciprocity?
that one, that's the one, that's the
Yeah.
word I was looking for. But yeah, and then it's felt, it's mutual, and they understand that you're a safe space where they can access that support, because we can be that one with the ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Some of our people grew up with so many of those, but the cool thing with that is can take only one person to help with those kind of things, and we can be that one person when as the worker, and helping incorporate culture into the care and service delivery with our clients that we're working with, and they can understand that they can go to this worker for that help if they want. So we can be that starting point sometimes. Hopefully that helps with that question.
It helped me. I know that. And I think like one of what I really like there too, you mentioned Brad, is like almost like follow their lead of how they're responding to the question to determine how much you do follow up. Like, and I appreciate that you mentioned trust. Like if I know you for a day, Brad, you might be not as willing to open up about certain things or openness to my questions as after we've been working together for a little while, and then I'm more receptive to your exploration and deepening the conversation, right? So, read what the individual is giving back to you a little bit, I would assume. Yeah. Okay. Um, we're over the time, but Brad, are we okay with one more question? Because I think this is a good one too. Do you have a couple more minutes? Is that okay? Okay. So they're referencing the VAT, which is an assessment tool again. So how can we approach assessment interviews from a culturally safe standpoint? Because this person's from BC, and so BC housing requires it to accompany housing applications, right? So you kind of mentioned this piece around using strength-based assessment tools as opposed to deficit-based one. My guess is that this question is suggesting that maybe the VAT is a little bit more deficiency-based. So how do we still use something like that in a culturally safe standpoint, knowing that it's attached to someone's ability to apply for housing?
I know that like Alosa created our own actually healing and housing assessment that has more questions so that we can use it as a team, as a housing support worker. But it also contains the answers to some of those other questions as well. It's a creative way of doing it. And just also the way that you do it, like Brad was saying about, put that paperwork aside and have a conversation and yeah, pick out the answers and do that paperwork afterwards, I guess. Focus more on the person and the relationship. What were you going to say, Brad?
Well, I was going to say I'm a little stumped on that one, but I was just going to say that if we can connect that with somebody, and unfortunately, sometimes a part of the work that we do is based on like these colonial institutions that we have to abide by and have to go in the way that they do things, and like something simple as starting with a smudge. I don't know if the Indigenous person is comfortable with that, and checking in, like mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. How are you doing? And saying this is my role as a worker, and these are unfortunately some of the paperworks that we have to abide by to go in this direction and access this kind of support. And sometimes maybe it's just that, just breaking it down for the person why you have to do that. I don't know if that makes sense, because I'm not fully familiar with that at all. But I just think culture is a big can be a big help in the work that we do and in the work that we do. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that piece too, that you're essentially saying like, let's not forget, like, we need to introduce the tool and preface like why it's being used, but also like explain that I might be asking some questions that might be difficult to answer. We can skip some, we can do it in different ways that you're comfortable with, so that the individual can make an informed decision and they can mentally prepare for this process, even if it's not necessarily the safest, easiest thing to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. As per usual, I've gone over time. My appreciate your commitment to a little bit of overtime. I do just want to say a big thank you, a merci miigwech, to everybody for attending, for your participation, for your questions, for your feedback, for your comments in the chat, for introducing yourself. I really, really find these webinars really great bucket fillers that I feel like we get more and more connected across wherever we find ourselves. And then again, a big thank you, merci miigwech, to Brad and Cass for delivering another awesome session. Totally appreciative of the time and effort that you put into our sessions together, and for sharing your knowledge. Deep, deep appreciation. Um, Tons and tons of respect for the work that you're doing over at Adlosa. And so thank you for sharing that with all of us. Any parting comments or thoughts or words from you, Brad or Cass? Oh,
Just thank you as well. Feeling grateful.
okay.
I just want to say the past is history. Tomorrow's a mystery. Today is a gift. That's why they call it a present. Kung Fu Panda taught me that, and time flies. And I knew I was getting old when somebody said to me, "Hey, Brad, nice alligator shoes." And I looked down and I was barefoot.
All right. If folks are wondering too, Brad is part-time comedian. Great material. So again, thank you so much. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their Wednesday, and look to see stuff coming out from today's session. I'll make sure to circulate it to everyone that registered, and look for information about our December webinar. So until then, everybody, have a great November. Bye for now.